When it comes to the X-Men, you have the universal favorites like Wolverine, Storm, Cyclops, and so on. Then comes the roster of less discussed mutants, such as Beast, Rogue, Jubilee, and Angel. Finally, you come to the names that most fans either dismiss completely or have a weirdly specific soft spot for. Mimic is one of those mutants, except that according to his original origin story, he was not actually a mutant. You see, he got his powers from a lab accident involving one of his father's dangerous experiments, which made him, as far as the original canon went, the first non-mutant to join the X-Men. And if you are familiar with the comics, you know that his story is messy. I mean, he does eventually get a redemption arc, but only after a lot of drama. His power revolves around mimicking the abilities of others, and he also retains the powers of the original 5 X-Men. You might be wondering what kind of anatomy he has to be able to do this, and it also raises a bigger question. Can mutants be manufactured in labs? For now, let us dig into his story to uncover his intriguing physiology and understand how his powers work. Who is Calvin Rankin, and why did the X-Men need a member who wasn't even a mutant? First introduced in X-Men number 19, Calvin was born in New Jersey as a human, and his father, Ronald Rankin, was involved in biological experiments. While he was a gifted researcher, he often worked with extremely unstable chemicals. Naturally, his son was forbidden from ever entering the lab, but you know how kids are. His curiosity prompted him to sneak into his father's lab one day when he was young, and he accidentally knocked over a beaker filled with something the older Rankin was working on. Calvin happened to inhale the fumes this chemical gave off, and they altered his biology. Of course, the full extent of his abilities did not manifest right away, but over time, the boy was able to mimic the actions of those around him. This allowed him to become extremely gifted at school and sports, since he could copy the abilities of those around him without them even knowing about it. He also grew up to be extremely arrogant and short-tempered, which was an obvious consequence of the fact that he never had to put in any real work and could simply depend on others. Eventually, he became isolated from his friends due to his poor attitude, but even that did not teach him a lesson. He was too absorbed in pride and self-confidence and developed a nasty, narcissistic streak. I am not joking here, this kid was a real menace. A teenager chasing an ego trip without putting in any effort is really one of the most annoying things in the world, don't you agree? His father finally learned about the change in his son's anatomy and rightfully freaked out. Calvin had become a living receptor of sorts, since he could duplicate not just the abilities of those around him, but their knowledge as well. Ronald knew that this would not sit well with either humans or mutants, because who in their right mind would feel comfortable around someone who could mimic their qualities down to a T? He took his son away from society and started building a machine to reverse the effect. Unfortunately, things did not end well for either of them because their efforts were discovered, and just as Ronald had expected, the people around them did not take kindly to them. I will talk about this issue at length in just a while, but I know you might be wondering why the X-Men even took in someone who was not a mutant. After all, this whole franchise is built on the idea of the Homo superior species, and mutants were at odds with humans precisely because they were different. So why accept someone who acquired mutant powers by accident and was not even a stand-up guy? There is a bit of a narrative issue here because the original character, created by Stan Lee and Werner Roth, was not presented as a mutant, as we have discussed. He got his powers as a result of a lab incident. However, writer Scott Lobdell later suggested that Calvin had been born with his mimicry mutation and that what happened in the lab simply triggered its awakening. This interpretation was not clearly established in the comics at the time, so it remains something fans debated. Marvel Comics Presents number 59 also shows that Calvin believed he might have possessed latent powers since birth, as his father had apparently experimented on himself before Calvin was born. House of X number 5 later classified Calvin as a mutant, but it did not explicitly explain every detail of how that classification fit with his original origin story. So, depending on which era of the comics you read, Mimic is either the team's one true human anomaly, or a mutant whose abilities were activated by the laboratory accident. How does the actual mimicry power work? Copying the ability or copying the person? What stands out to me most in the X-Men universe is not necessarily the fact that these people have special abilities and can do cool stuff. That is a very simplistic explanation, merely chalking all of it up to them being different from regular people. And if this were the pattern Marvel had followed, I do not think the franchise would have become as popular as it is. What truly interests me is the fact that each mutant has a unique biology that allows them to exercise and sometimes regulate their powers. So, in the case of Mimic, it is not as though he is a photocopy machine that simply produces an output based on what he sees others do. Many fans also lean too heavily into the idea of stealing powers. But that is not an accurate description of his ability, and this is what makes him different from Rogue. On paper, they might seem to have similar powers, but if you dig deeply enough, you will see that they have completely different mechanisms. Calvin is not grabbing powers and skills out of thin air. The comics do not consistently provide a detailed scientific explanation for how his ability functions, but they establish that he can copy the powers, physical traits, knowledge, and skills of people within a limited range. He retains the acquired abilities while remaining within the required proximity, although the exact range and duration have varied throughout the comics. And this is not limited to mutant powers, because if you remember, I said that in school he was able to acquire the same level of knowledge as his most brilliant peers. Whenever he is in the vicinity of someone, he can mimic their skills and certain personal abilities. So imagine that you are a straight-A student taking your LSAT, hoping to get into Harvard Law. If Calvin is in the same room as you, he will not exactly copy your answers, but your presence can grant him access to the same knowledge and scholarly abilities you possess. When he mimics a mutant, he is not just copying their moves like Kakashi, nor is he taking away their powers like Rogue. Mimic's body can temporarily reproduce the physical characteristics required to use the abilities he copies. Otherwise, how else can you explain why he develops physical attributes tied to whomever he is mimicking? In Extermination number 3, Calvin's wings are transplanted onto a time-displaced angel, and they are compatible because they duplicate Angel's natural mutation. Now, the question of how long he retains mimicked powers is also something that has not been consistent throughout the comics. As I mentioned, initially there was a catch. He would lose the powers if the person he mimicked moved beyond his effective range. He could also mimic multiple mutants at the same time instead of imitating only one person's powers, so that compounding effect made him a very formidable opponent. For instance, if he were facing 5 mutants, he could attack them using their combined abilities at the same time. I will get to the part where he managed to retain some powers permanently in a little while, but before that we should take a look at his villain origin story. What actually happened in the issue that started it all? X-Men number 19 fleshes out his entire backstory and also serves as the issue in which he first steps into villain territory. This also happens to be the final regular issue of X-Men scripted by Stan Lee. Did you know that? Picking up from where we left off, Calvin and his father moved away, and the latter tried to build a machine in an abandoned mine that could make Calvin human again. However, he kept its true purpose a secret from his son and said that the machine would instead allow him to retain his mimicked powers and abilities permanently. Maybe he realized that Calvin was set on a dangerous path with a giant ego, or perhaps he simply wanted to keep him safe and normal like everyone around him. Unfortunately, the machine required a great deal of power to operate, which inconvenienced the people of the town because they needed electricity too. One day, a mob gathered outside the mine to deal out some good old-fashioned street justice against the mad scientist. But Ronald blasted the main entrance with explosives so they could not enter. Unfortunately, he miscalculated just how intense the explosion would be and ended up losing his life. The machine was also buried under the rubble, so it could not be used. Anyway, as fate would have it, Calvin later found himself meeting the real X-Men while pursuing a woman named Vera Cantor, who was actually on a date with Hank McCoy, aka Beast. He became insanely jealous and tried to fight Hank without knowing his true identity. Beast, in turn, reined in his power because they were in civilian clothes, and he did not want to create a scene. However, this sheer proximity triggered Calvin into temporarily gaining Hank's powers, and later Bobby's as well. Although he initially ran away, confused by these sudden abilities, he later deduced that the people he had fought were none other than the X-Men. When a chance meeting with Jean gave him temporary telekinesis, he decided to follow her and find out where they were all staying. It did not take long, and when he found them, he put on an act, asking for forgiveness while technically mimicking the power of every mutant there. He even managed to use Professor X's telepathy to shield his thoughts from him, which naturally made the man suspicious. This is the part where you realize that he was not as clever as he thought he was, because who would try to double-cross the guy who controls minds? Anyway, a fight soon followed during which he officially adopted his moniker, Mimic. Despite using the combined abilities of all the mutants against them, he was unable to defeat them as a group and resorted to running away with Jean. However, he did not demand a ransom as such. He simply took her to the abandoned mine where he and his father had worked on creating the machine we spoke about. He was trying to use the mutants' combined powers to unearth the machine and make his mimicking ability permanent, as his father had promised. As you can probably imagine, all these efforts were wasted when the machine ultimately took away his abilities and knocked him out. The X-Men were able to rescue him and the Professor before the overloaded machine went up in flames. Calvin's memories of being Mimic were wiped clean so that everyone could return to their usual lives. For what it was worth, he ended up living a normal life for a while, but his powers and memories eventually returned. I know this is supposed to be his villain origin story, but if anything, it makes me feel a little bad for him. The accident that gave him powers was not intentional, but the way his personality devolved as a result was disappointing. His father was simply trying to keep him safe, hence the lie, but it also became the thread Calvin held onto for the longest time, chasing the illusion that his powers could become permanent. Maybe things would have gone differently if he had been allowed to grow up with the right kind of discipline, but who can say? Why did Mimic keep sliding into villain territory instead of staying a hero? In the comics, Mimic continuously shifts between being a hero and a villain, so for the most part, he does not have an established identity. At a glance, it is easy to dismiss him as a villain because he definitely did a lot of questionable things, but I do not think he deserves that label. You see, he was not an evil guy as such. His constant flip-flopping between good and bad was more of an identity crisis because he could not place himself firmly in either category. After his initial run-in and eventual loss of powers, which we just discussed, he joined the X-Men in X-Men number 27. But it was here that he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be an outcast, even among outcasts. After all, his strengths and powers were never originally his, so he felt that he would always be the fall guy. I am no clinical expert, but these certainly appeared to be the symptoms of depression when I read this for the first time. This is why, even after becoming the deputy leader of the X-Men, he never established any real connection with the team. This social isolation and the way he was constantly monitored by Professor X threw him off, and finally, in X-Men number 29, he got into a heated confrontation with the man. Charles Xavier told him that he would have to keep his ego and anger in check if he wanted to remain part of the team, or he would have to leave. This was the last straw, as Calvin understood that he was not exactly wanted by anyone there, and he left the school. However, later in the same issue, he ended up saving the X-Men from the clutches of the Super Adaptoid and was finally given a much-deserved apology by the team. Things genuinely looked brighter because he himself said that losing his powers was worth it because, for the first time in his life, he was surrounded by friends and had learned what it meant to be a man. In fact, in Dark X-Men: The Beginning, Dr. Moira McTaggart's notes indicated that his anger issues and impulsiveness stemmed from previously undiagnosed bipolar disorder, which neither he nor those around him had recognized. So, all those swings between hero and villain were not simply about him having a fickle sense of mortality. His power was unique, but it also prevented him from developing a stable identity for the longest time. After the comics established his mental health condition, his erratic behavior and mood swings made a lot more sense. How did he end up permanently keeping the original X-Men's powers? After he finally found his place among the X-Men, he did mourn losing his powers a little, but I think he also felt a great sense of relief at finally being Calvin Rankin and not Mimic. Unfortunately, his powers returned soon enough and became so intense that people near him started suffering potentially fatal effects. Beast and Vera tried to find a way to cure this condition, or at least lower the intensity of the power, but unfortunately they were attacked by the Hulk. This happened in The Incredible Hulk number 161, and Calvin was there as well. After absorbing the Hulk's gamma radiation, he appeared to sacrifice himself to protect others from the destructive effects of his own uncontrolled power. He was thought to be dead, but this was not the end of his story. He eventually returned, and in Marvel Comics Presents number 56 through 61, his body took on Wolverine's appearance and abilities, including his claws and healing factor. Here's the catch, though. He was not actually Wolverine despite looking like him. He did not handle the intense pain from having the claws, so we see him rampaging through pharmacies to obtain painkillers before finally getting help from Banner and Wolverine themselves. He was taught Zen meditation techniques to suppress his ability, but this only calmed him down and did not permanently remove his powers. The exact reason he permanently retained the original X-Men's abilities has not always been explained consistently. However, the comics established that the powers of Cyclops, Iceman, Beast, Angel, and Jean Grey eventually became permanent parts of his standard power set. It feels like a full circle moment, right? This guy spent so much of his early life trying to force permanence out of a machine that was actually designed to take away his powers, but he ultimately ended up with some of the coolest and most intimidating abilities in the entire X-Men roster. It was only a matter of time. What happened when Onslaught and the mysterious figure called Sledge got involved? Following the events surrounding X-Force number 45 and 46, Mimic was manipulated into attacking X-Force after being brainwashed by Sebastian Shaw. During the conflict, a devastating explosion left Mimic badly injured. He was later found and helped by the mysterious deviant mechanic known as Sledge, who assisted him in gaining greater control over his powers. This is one of my favorite pockets of Mimic lore to nerd out about, and let me explain why. As I have already stated, for the longest time he needed proximity to a subject to gain and maintain their powers, while only a limited group of abilities become permanent. However, his abilities were later modified so that he could retain additional powers much more quickly, instead of needing prolonged exposure. This enhancement was connected to Sledge's intervention, leading to Mimic gaining more mastery over his powers. You could say that before this, Calvin merely reacted to the powers he gained from being around mutants and used them in a fairly one-dimensional way. After learning to control them, it stopped being a mere reaction, and he started steering his abilities more consciously. What was the Dark X-Men and Thunderbolts Prisoner arc about? Before I start this section, I want to clarify that a lot of things happen across multiple comic issues during this phase, and it is not humanly possible for me to go into the details of everything, because we would be here for 3 business days straight. So I am going to condense it to the best of my ability, but in case it feels disjointed, please let me know in the comments and I can make another video solely about the individual comics mentioned here. Now, where were we? Right, following a period in which Calvin became involved with a new brotherhood of mutants, he was eventually captured by the Thunderbolts and imprisoned. During the post-Civil War era, the Thunderbolts were tasked with apprehending unregistered superhumans and recruiting or containing powerful individuals. Then, after M-Day, thanks to the Scarlet Witch, most of the world's mutants lost their powers. Calvin was one of the rare exceptions, which sounded good only on paper. He tried controlling his mood swings with medication, but lost control of his powers one day and accidentally caused the death of an innocent pedestrian. He was then recruited by Norman Osborn, as seen in Dark X-Men The Beginning, number 1. Mimic was happy because he genuinely believed he was fighting for the good guys, which led him to go up against his former teammates and friends without hesitation. This was definitely him acting in the role of villain, but once again, it was not because he was innately evil. Calvin was pretty much being used as a convenient pawn by Osborn, and made to believe that he was simply doing some bad things for the greater good. Later, he experienced a vision of a possible future due to being close to Nate Gray, in which he saw a happy family life waiting for him with Vera and their child. Unfortunately, in that version of the future, Calvin lost control of his powers and fired an optic blast at his wife and child, killing them both. He tried to talk to Nate to find a way to change that future, but they started fighting before they were able to discuss it. How did the Jean Grey School finally give him a real redemption arc? When Weapon Omega, aka Michael Pointer's powers, went out of control, Calvin tried his best to help his friends avoid turning into a literal walking bomb. He first turned to Rogue for help, proposing that together they could siphon off the excess energy themselves, but it did not exactly work out. Calvin realized that the only way to save Michael was essentially to shut down his mind and allow him to rest in stasis. He also did not want to leave his friend's side, so the school welcomed him as a teacher to help guide students who were facing similar crises. You could say that this officially began his redemption arc. I really like the way the writers framed all of it because his friendship with Rogue stands at the center here, and the very fact that it was she who offered him a helping hand was doubly profound. After all, she herself had gone through a lot while learning to live with powers that were so similar to Mimic's. Right from the beginning, when Mimic was first introduced to us, I could not help but draw parallels between him and Rogue, because of both how similar and how different they were. Bringing them back together in such a heartwarming manner was something the writers deserve a pat on the back for. When Michael eventually recovered, Calvin was torn between leaving the school and staying there, which itself tells you just how much of an impact this period had on him. He eventually did leave after talking to Rogue and weighing his options, choosing to help ordinary people with his abilities instead of taking on missions as part of any fancy team. I guess this is why people say teaching is one of the most noble professions out there, because it not only involves imparting knowledge but also using that same knowledge to become a better person. Did Marvel really retcon him into an actual mutant, and why does that matter? I mentioned House of X number 5 only in passing a while back, when I said that Calvin was classified as a mutant. Released in 2019, this comic is set during the Krakoa era, and identifies Mimic as a mutant whose abilities could potentially make him a substitute for a member of the Five. Is it a bad storyline? I don't think so, but it also feels a little difficult to accept for longtime fans like me, who have pretty much grown up knowing Calvin as someone who was originally presented as a non-mutant. His entire arc, the Depression, the decades of being used by people like Osborn, all of it, worked because we were told that he occupied a strange position between humans and mutants. So a complete 180-degree turn in his origin story feels like a rewriting of everything that happened, and it also gives him a different kind of identity crisis than we are used to seeing. Earlier, he was a human who acquired mutant-like abilities by chance, but if we go by the newer interpretation, then he is a mutant who spent most of his life not knowing it and was treated like an intruder by his own community for no good reason. What do you think? Was this a good decision, or should they have stuck to the original concept? Where does an alternate, more heroic version of Calvin fit into the Exiles? Speaking of the whole natural-born mutant and human-turned-into-mutant debate, the Exiles comic series focuses on a Calvin Rankin from Earth-12, where he is shown as someone born with the X gene. The laboratory accident never happened in this continuity, and Calvin manifested his powers when he reached puberty. This version of Calvin actually got the clean redemption arc that his mainline counterparts spent decades chasing, because he was reformed under Professor X's influence and went on to become the leader of the X-Men on Earth-12. His power works differently here as well, as his mimicking ability comes with a hard cap. He can hold a maximum of 5 mutant power sets at once, each operating at roughly half the intensity of the original, and he cannot copy knowledge or skills the way his mainline counterpart can. The height of his heroism on Earth-12 was seen in Exiles number 73, when the reality warper Proteus possessed his power while searching for a stronger host. Mimic's body began to burn out under the strain, and his teammates were ultimately unable to save him. His sacrifice and final actions gave the Exiles an opportunity to continue their fight against Proteus. Whatever remained of him was taken back to Earth-12, where he was given a hero's burial. Near the end of his life, his 5 active power templates included Wolverine's abilities, Northstar's super speed, Deadpool's healing factor, Cyclops' optic blasts, and Colossus's organic steel form. Has Mimic ever shown up outside the comics? The reason Mimic is not exactly a household name like Wolverine or Jean Grey is that he has made very few appearances outside the comics, and even those were mostly cameos that were easily overlooked. His first animated appearance was as a non-speaking background character in One Man's Worth Part 1 from X-Men the Animated Series. The episode is set in an alternate timeline where Charles Xavier is killed before he can form the X-Men, and Mimic is seen as part of Magneto's team. Then we see him again in X-Men 97 in the 7th episode of Season 1 titled Bright Eyes. Here as well, he is given a background role with no dialogue. Calvin Rankin remains, for better or worse, a character who lives almost entirely on the comic page, and these cameos feel more like slight nods to longtime readers than any real attempt to bring him to a wider audience. Mimic is not a clean hero by any measure, and he has spent years cycling through phases in which he did bad things, even though he was sometimes manipulated into doing them. He was never the strongest X-Man or the most disciplined one, but he did not hesitate to do the right thing at times, such as when he joined the fight against Super Adaptoid. The world dealt him a bad hand, no doubt, but he ultimately managed to come out of everything with a more or less clean slate, don't you think? This is why his anatomy is so closely connected to his evolution, from an ego-driven teenager to an experienced teacher. After all, the powers he retained permanently did not come easily to him. If you want more deep dives into the corners of Marvel lore that do not get enough attention, make sure to subscribe and stick around for the next one. So long!